Robert Nivelle, and it began in April, early April, and lasted till May of 1917. It, despite despite sort of the early predictions of the higher command, the Allied higher command, uh, Robert Nivelle only anticipated 10,000 casualties. Um, so I mean, it was well planned. It was well executed. They had quite a heavy artillery bombardment beforehand, as was quite typical of uh, military tactics at that specific time. They like to try and lay waste to any of the defensive positions, but obviously the Germans were very used to this by 1917, and they had reinforced their front lines so that they weren't dependent on shallow trenches. They had entire network systems, tunnels, bunkers, all interconnecting, concrete, gun emplacements, you name it, it was there. And for whatever reason, Robert Nivelle really under-anticipated the just how well dug in the Germans were during this offensive. And what I'm taking from this is that, having done a little bit of reading up on the background of it, it was almost like the French. It was the French Third Army that went in, and basically it was made up of three attacks. There was a diversionary attack, which is the French army attack, and that was in early April. And the aim of that was to draw German reinforcements away from the main attack, which hadn't yet started. So they'd started, by doing this, they'd achieved their initial objective in sort of diverting those reinforcements away. But it was at the expense of very heavy casualty numbers. And as you remember, I said that he anticipated 10,000 casualties, which in itself, 10,000 casualties, is pretty horrendous when you think. That's especially when you try and compare it to any standards by nowadays. We don't really have anything to compare that to. But unfortunately for them, out of 850,000 soldiers that took part in that, French, English, and Russian soldiers that participated in that, over 187,000 lost their lives. So, I mean, 10,000 anticipated, but they lost 187,000. That's incredible. I don't think that's almost a third of its main attacking force, for the French Third Army. And these armies were made up generally of sort of 750,000 men. Obviously, it was a bit changing depending on which army you're discussing, but with the French army, it was generally 750,000 men. They were backed up, the French, by the British First, Third, and Fifth Army, and their objective was the second part of the plan. So you had the initial part of the plan, which I've just discussed, where they've tried. This is going on over here. They've tried to draw their reinforcements away, and then the French are going to come up and they're going to hit them where they're anticipating them to be, again, strategically weak. However, they've again under-anticipated the German strength and their ability to just repel wave upon wave of assaults on their lines. Bearing in mind that those French soldiers and those British soldiers have got to overcome the actual trench systems themselves, brimming with sharpshooters, machine gun nests. They've got to overcome barbed wire, foxholes. The ground is just going to be. I mean, it's at this stage, 1917. This is the second. This is the second time that there's been a big battle on this patch of ground that we're talking about, on top of three and a half years of constant fighting from 1914. So when you think about what the ground would be like in that situation, it ceases to be mud and tends to be a concoction of body parts that are all various levels of decay. Obviously the ground gets very churned up, mud. You've got a lot of the gases and chemicals being sort of creating like a layer on top of a green algae layer. So you mix all these things in, and you just think all that mixture and soup and concoction of what would have once been, human remains, and but has now been churned up so many times, by artillery strikes. All that's really left is just pulp and bone and, little bits of raggedy bits of skin and brain here and there, perhaps, but that's all going to be mashed up into one big mixing bowl. And this is what these guys are going to have to be running over. And essentially, you're not going to be able to get much more than a couple yards out of your own trench before you're going to get hit by artillery, by a sniper, by one of the three LMG nests that will be giving converging fire on your position and your squad's position. So these guys were really up against it, and that's just crossing no man's land, before they even get into the initial trench systems. They were able to achieve their initial objectives. The French, who, they were able to draw the Germans away, but the overall outcome was considered indecisive. Both the Central Powers and the Allied armies, lost heavily. I mean, just to give you an idea, there were 480,000 participating German troops. They lost 163,000. Yeah, 100,000. And it's just incredible that those numbers. That's just if you're a general in that position, then you've got to be able to adapt your strategy, your tactic around this, and for a lot of these generals, a lot of them weren't able to cope with the pressure, especially early on, during the initial stages of 1914, when you see the forming up of the two sort of main forces, the Central Powers and the Allied forces at that time, throughout Belgium and France. You see just the pressure build up, and that really does show, because you have almost like a string of suicides amongst high-ranking staff who otherwise you wouldn't anticipate. You'd anticipate these people to be quite strong people, but when you think of the initial mathematics and all the problems that they would have faced, deploying an army that's a couple million men in size, across an area like Belgium, which has only got very small, inadequate roads, and you've got to have all these people form up and make sure that they've all got their own route to approach whatever their destination is. Otherwise, they're going to get caught up with each other and create traffic chaos. You've got to think these people have to eat, they have to rest, they have to be provided with logistics. So there was a lot of movement. In fact, it's considered the biggest movement of human beings ever. The initial phase of World War One, that first 2 months, you saw incredible amounts of men and just converge like that. And obviously that's where they stayed for 4 years, and that's they never ever got past that. In the end they had to walk away from it. No one ever got past that situation. So when you take into consideration that you've got all these men meeting in one place at one time, you think of the ongoing stress that would have been going on behind the sort of scenes, and the logistics involved, and just the mathematics involved of getting these the right supplies, the right men to the right part of the line at the right, it's just mind-boggling, and that's essentially what it did come down to. It was really mathematical, and they were, they got down to the point where they were able to say, right, well, so many train axles will go over this bridge in this length of time. That's how accurate it was. That's how particular they had to be. So it only took one little hold up to delay the whole German army, progressing through Belgium. And bearing in mind that when they were going into Belgium, they weren't bothered. They weren't there to invade Belgium. They were there to get to France. They wanted to get through as quickly to western coast of France as quickly as possible so that they could come back and go back over to the east side, defend themselves from Russia. But the problem was they didn't anticipate that Belgium would be made up of really small roads and really angry little Belgian people who would, try and blow up all their railway junctions, bridges, telephone wires, anything that helped the Germans move supplies from A to B. And the Germans, initially were like, no, don't do that. We're not here for you. Don't do that. But if you're going to do that, we are going to shoot you. We're gonna commit some atrocities on you, and that happened. In the first couple of days, there were civilians that were getting rounded up and shot. Not on the same scale, and nothing along the lines of what we saw in the 1939-45 conflict. This is more sort of to do, this is more a local level really, and something that was specifically kept to Belgium. But with this going on, it really, as I say, there were two things going on. The Germans were being slowed down, and this was creating stress on their side because they, as I say, they just wanted to bust through Belgium, get to the far side of France, and then come back and secure their eastern front against Russia because Germany felt threatened. But the second thing is that as a result of these atrocities that were getting committed against the Belgians, these civilians that were getting shot, the propaganda machine in places like Britain went into overdrive, and they were really able to use the situation in Belgium as a sort of galvanizer, something to really stimulate the young people into sort of signing up to the army. And at this stage, Britain hadn't quite declared war on Germany. We're talking the first 48 hours really of the German advance through Belgium. So bearing in mind this is still 1914, and it takes a little bit of time for word to travel, and a little bit of back and forth. And in that time, the Germans are slowly pushing through Belgium. The King of Belgium has said, "No, I'm not having that. I want my people, the people of Belgium, to put up as much fight as possible." And here's the funny thing about Belgium and the Belgians in general. They when whilst every other war whilst every other country was building up and preparing itself and training its armies and supplying everybody and building rifles, you have to bear in mind that Belgium wasn't doing this. Belgium was just simply sitting back, and their attitude was, well, we can either prepare and put a lot of time and effort into preparing for this, or for this inevitable war that's going to happen, or we can not put much time and effort in at all. We can relax, and we can accept that whoever invades us. But we know that if we sign a treaty with Britain, they'll come and protect us. So Britain was protecting Belgium. We had our interests, to do that, and as a result, Britain declared war on Germany, and and the rest is history. So, hey Lucas, no, I'm not, buddy. No, are you? But yeah. So I mean, it just it goes to show. Coming back to my original point way back when, these generals, they were under tremendous amounts of pressure to make the right decisions, and for a lot of them, it was too much, and they ended up shooting themselves. Which obviously led to people being promoted up in their stead, which obviously I think they'd had the opportunity to see what had happened, what had gone right, what had gone wrong, and they've been able to sort of act on that really. So let's just. And whilst this is all going on in, ooh, crikey, that doesn't feel good. And whilst this is all going on in Belgium, just to the south, you've got the same sort of, well, you've got another of the German armies moving up, trying to gain position in the sort of southern southeast of France. And for them, the main French army, bless them, they went up against this army. And they got completely wiped out, which pretty much put France out of the not out of the war, but it definitely reduced their capacity for a number of months and years after that assault. Um, but just to give you an idea of well, guys, of how many sort of numbers that we were going up against in those initial stages. You saw 500,000 men mobilised um, with the Central Powers, and then that went up against 130. Sorry, 1,000 no, 130,000 soldiers from the British Expeditionary Force, amongst obviously the French and what small forces the Belgians had. I mean, the interesting thing as well about Belgium is, again, they didn't really. How do I put this? They didn't really have, because they didn't have this massive army. They weren't capable of it. They didn't have the land, the resources. They So they had to cope with other sort of defensive techniques, and they basically used a series of forts along the eastern border of Belgium, the border that borders with Germany. And these forts, they were built in the 1880s. So by this stage, people had already realised that forts were obsolete. I think more or less, and they'd stopped building them. But you do see one of the last sort of fort-style defences mounted by the Belgians in the prelude to World War One, and the casualties that they were able to inflict on the German army were just incredible. You've got stories of people writing after the war, and they were saying, the Germans were the bodies were they were getting killed in that greater numbers that the bodies were stacking up on top of each other, and there was literally walls of bodies that the Germans could then use as cover. So the French commander had to send out parties to clear these mounds of bodies, because it was getting to the point where they were providing effective cover for the advancing troops that were coming in. And you just think, try and gain some perspective on the. I'm trying to see how far my chair's going to go back. You try and gain some perspective on how how that must have looked, or how that must it's just incredible to think that that people would just keep running up against those impregnable positions, and eventually they were overrun, but not before the Germans were delayed very significantly, to the point where the British were able to send over reinforcements. It really, I mean, as I say, they didn't get any further. They got further into France. They almost got as far as Paris, but it was hard work from that point on. From once they'd hit that as we discussed before, that wall, there was very little give and take, and in the end they had to walk away from it. So over the last couple of weeks here at Hardcore League, we've had a very busy month. I'm trying to think how many matches we're on now. I think we're getting up to 60 matches this year, and we're seeing just untold